Okay, we're already online on YouTube as well. So just maybe 5 minutes and we'll start.
I haven't heard that one before.
It's better to know, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Everything is recorded. There should be a constant voice, or maybe just, on streets announcing regularly once in a half an hour. Everything is recorded.
Yeah, exactly.
Beware, people.
True.
First, everything is recorded.
Mm.
Okay. I guess we should start. I'll start with some introduction, and while I'll be talking, more people would join us on Zoom and on YouTube. Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Alexander Strogorsky, and I'm teaching at the Moscow Architecture School March. Welcome to another meeting of the series of talks dealing with architecture education, its present state and possible futures, if there is any. The idea of these talks is to explore different views on how we teach and learn, as much different as we manage to get. We have invited experts from many places and different schools and let them decide for themselves where they want the conversation to go based on what issues they consider to be most pressing or what insights they have from their experiences of the last month when lots of schools had to start teaching online. The meeting will be held in English. You can use the globe icon on the control panel in Zoom to switch to translation. Встреча пройдет на английском языке. Если вам нужен перевод, то воспользуйтесь значком глобуса на панели управления Zoom и переключитесь на перевод. Later we will upload a YouTube video with Russian translation. Today we have a conversation in the form of an interview, which is a new thing for this series. I will introduce our guests right away. Salomon Frausto, the Director of Studies in the Berlage, part of the Delft University of Technology. Salomon's scholarly focus is on architecture at the intersection of pedagogy, criticism, and communication. His book, Architourism, Authentic, Exotic, Escapist, Spectacular, published in 2005, explored the role of architecture in the contemporary tourist imagination. In the forthcoming book, 12 Institutional and Public Buildings Revisited, documents buildings kept outside of the canon of modern architecture. He's also working on a research and a book about Theo Crosby, a cross-disciplinary architect, famous for This Is Tomorrow exhibition in 1950s, involvement with Architectural Design magazine, and for the foundation of the world-famous design firm Pentagram in 1970s. And Salomon will be interviewed by Léa-Catherine Szацka. She's a lecturer in architectural studies at the Manchester Architecture Research Group at the Manchester University. Apart from this, Léa-Catherine is also involved in some research and teaching activities at the Berlage, including the latest one, tutoring the research project Space, Television, and Architecture. Her work focuses on the history of architecture exhibitions, the history and theory of postmodern architecture, and on the relationship between media and architecture. As I said, this conversation between Salomon and Léa-Catherine will be new in terms of format, but it also includes a new type of educational institution in the discussion which we have started 2 weeks ago. If you look at any of top 10, top 100 ranking lists of architecture schools published every year, despised, but nevertheless carefully studied by many educators. If we look through them, we will find their names of some large schools, usually parts of even larger universities like MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Delft University, ETH Zurich, and so on. And there are many historical and pragmatic reasons for the landscape of architecture education to be dominated by institutions of large scale, including learning resources like libraries and workshops, which they provide, program certification and its connections with licensing, credibility of an institution providing sometimes very costly courses of architecture training. But there are also other institutions, smaller, more flexible, maybe even risky. We usually think of them as oriented towards research rather than training, experiment rather than repetition, multidisciplinary rather than something else, and so on. And we could also think that any novelty in architecture education comes from these type of schools. We could remember the Bauhaus and Hutemas, or the International Institute of Design of Alvin Boyarsky in the 1970s, and maybe the Berlage Institute itself. Or sometimes we think that this kind of experience, educational and research experience, could come from students happily achieved certain level of autonomy to become schools inside schools. Anyway, the relationships between these small experimental educational bodies and large institutions, these relations are not simple, but that's why they are interesting. So that's possibly what we will discuss today. As usual, after about an hour of conversation, we'll be happy to get some questions from you in our Zoom chat or in our chat on YouTube, and I will address those questions to our guests. Well, this is where I stop to give the virtual floor to Salomon and Léa-Catherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, for the invitation, and thank you to Léa-Catherine for well, being the sparring partner in this, what I hope will be more conversation at some point than a merely an interview, or let's say a dialogue.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's the idea, that we structure. There were a series of these conversations before that all kind of took different format or different interaction between the two guests. So we decided to structure it a bit more as an interview, but yeah, as Salomon said, I think it will probably evolve or move more organically into a conversation. We also discussed a lot of these topics before with Salomon. So yeah, and then we'll take the questions eventually from the public. So Salomon, I think we should start from now, or from, although the Berlage has a very rich and complicated and exciting history. This year is important because it marks the 30th anniversary of the institution. You welcome this year, last fall, in fall 2019, you welcomed the generation 30, because every year in the Berlage has a generation number, and you can see the list on the Berlage website, all the list of everyone who's been through this institution. So it's a 30th anniversary and generation 30. The institution, for those who are not familiar with the story, opened in 1990, and it's very important to say it's an hybrid sort of educational project and cultural institution. So it's both a post-professional master and a public program at the same time, and the two are very closely intricate together. And then the Berlage, I mean, to really do a very short history, from being the Berlage Institute became in 2012 the Berlage Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture and Urban Studies, and at the same time moved into TU Delft, which also mean that it changed a little bit because it went from an independent, unaccredited, correct me if I'm wrong, postgraduate school to a small institution located in a bigger one, and that give accredited master degrees. So the school also moved location from Amsterdam first, then in Rotterdam, and then in Delft. And so that's the very, very short history. Of course, it's much richer than that. And so I wanted to start, Salomon, by asking, when did you join this adventure? When did you came to the Berlage, and how did you relate to, of course, the history? So what was before, but also what is your sort of guiding principle or your educational project for the Berlage?
Well, I arrived at the Berlage in January of 2007. And at that moment, my role was really to deal with the public programming aspects. So what was at the time termed architectural broadcasting. So in essence, it was to, let's say, curate the public programs, serve as the editor-in-chief of publications, at that time launch a website which had never really existed before, only in a piecemeal version. I hate to say this, we're now in a similar predicament now, which is sort of ironic. And what ended up basically happening was I became an accidental educator in this process. So when we moved to the TU Delft in 2012 as a kind of institution within an institution, I was charged with the task to essentially build upon the legacy of the 22 years before, and to figure out a way to, let's say, make the Berlage participate within the TU Delft system. And what was very important is it was a very kind of contentious moment, because there was the sort of, the Berlage had originally been founded as a kind of, as an opposition in a way to the Faculty of Architecture at TU Delft, as something that was to be radical and independent and non-institutional, if we can put it in this way. And so I thought it was very important to take the responsibility to maintain the identity and the character, but to also see the possibility of what the relationship with the TU Delft and the Faculty of Architecture could bring. So not only the mechanics of an accredited degree, which for 22 years before that was always a sort of contentious issue, that it was an unaccredited degree, but to basically maintain the character, stand on the institutional shoulders, remain having our independent identity, but also gaining something from the TU Delft and Baukunde, as well as giving something back to that larger institution. So on the one hand, pretentiousness aside, I think we're somewhere between a Trojan horse and a jewel box. And those are two words that within sort of Calvinist modesty, or two descriptions would be probably people would fight against, but I still am searching after all these years, what is the kind of, what is the right description for what it is that we do. But I guess my personal, so let's say that's, one of the things that we discussed was this idea of or one of my interests in this idea of deschooling that Alexander and his colleagues had put forward is that there's already implicitly this, there's a kind of anti-institutional reverberation or addiction to that. And I have to say that my thinking more and more these days is more towards the institutional, and let's say this moment, our age of quarantine, has led that thinking for me to even be more certain of that. And maybe one of those things is not only the institution of the Berlage itself and maintaining a kind of continuity, building upon the shoulders of others, and also developing a kind of project of an educational project of one's own. But I also think that at this particular moment, there is a desire for institutions, and maybe not the institutions of the past, but the idea of institutions as, let's say, framing devices for a culture. I think I lost somebody. Hello? Did we?
Léa-Catherine, are you here? Are you there?
You hear me fine, right? I think my internet connection is. There.
I'm sorry. I think my connection has decided that it doesn't work now, just now, so it's perfect.
Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I didn't get, of course, your last few sentences, but
no, I was just probably being repetitious as per usual. But I was just.
You were talking about the institutionalization and the
maybe
kind
more than now
necessity of that.
We need institutions more than now, I guess would be one of my points. And maybe it's not institutions of the past, but new forms of institutions. And I really personally see that as my role, not only as at the Berlage and that kind of position, but also as a kind of scholar and architectural thinker, is what are the kinds of institutions that we need for architectural education, culture, and practice.
Right. You might have to finish this conversation alone. I'm not sure what's going on, but I'll try. So you talked a little bit about the relationship with the TU Delft, and we can say maybe a bit more about that, especially I think it brings me to this kind of dual aspect or dual aim of the institution, which is both to deliver post-professional degrees, which means or post-professional master degree, which means, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a master degree for someone who already either had a master or went into the profession and then came back to school. And at the same time, and this is for a very small group of students, so in the last few years, I'm not sure, I mean, it varied a lot, but in the last few years, let's say between 10 and 15 students. And then there is a public program. And the public program, I guess it's also where it really intersects with the rest of TU Delft. So we see, for example, images of
maybe Léa, maybe is it possible to tether from your phone? If you can hear us.
I'm back.
I just wonder, is it possible to maybe tether from your phone so you don't get switched by the Wi-Fi or stopped by the Wi-Fi?
I am on the Wi-Fi.
But if you tether from your iPhone, maybe
yeah, that's a good idea.
Then it gives a kind of consistency.
I'll try that. Yeah.
I just remeshed my own connection, my own Wi-Fi here, because I was tethering for ages on the on the phone.
Yes. Okay. I'm on the 4G now, so let's see if it's better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much I'll repeat the question,
Sure, of
but
course.
I was just talking about the overlap with the TU Delft and the fact that delivers a post-professional master to a small group of students between like 10 and 15, and then at the same time has the Berlage is also a public program, and it has always been since the beginning on different formats. So it had also at a period it had diverse different publications such as the Berlage Cahier, the Berlage Papers and Hunch that were associated, and now of course there's a lot of public lectures and the typical image we see of the public lecture at the Berlage are in the orange, how do you call it, the famous orange staircase at TU Delft, where it's obviously full of people. So I think that's really the moment when the two things come together and the two things intersect. So do you have more to say? I mean, you said a bit about that, but about these overlaps, maybe conflicts or negotiating boundaries between the two institutions, so to speak. I mean, that's a very unusual situation.
Of course. I mean, I have to say that since our arrival in 2012, there has been basically generosity from the powers that be in all guises at TU Delft to find ways to make our exceptional circumstance work, in the sense that, you know, within a kind of larger university context, we are an other, and it does require negotiation, because in a kind of large organism as a university, as you well know from your own experience, I'm sure, there's a desire for sameness, and we're always fighting for a little bit of difference, not to be different for the sake of being different, but to basically, my viewpoint is always to be complementary, and to provide something other, maybe in relation to, maybe one thing to kind of just in a way sort of put on the record. This issue of what is a postmaster, what is post-professional, these are all kinds of questions that are always a kind of open question. And this, I think, is fundamental for architectural education in general, not just the Berlage, but where we, all of our students come as having had an architectural previous degree, architecture degree. So they are, in most cases, already qualified architects. So they have had a kind of, but this now in a kind of globalized context, this is radically different in all sorts of parts of the world. What does this mean? So it used to be that before Bologna, you would have the 5-year degree program, especially in the Netherlands or in other places where you would finish your 5 years and you would basically be able to sign construction documents, and you could start to take on legal responsibilities. In the Netherlands, that changed a few years ago, where that it now requires more like the American system or REBA, different but more similar, where this became professionalized, where that kind of that ability was lost, and it requires a kind of 2-year internship and possibly some exams. I'm not really, to be honest, for certain. But what now happens is there are radical misunderstandings or unclear definitions of what a postmaster is. So within the kind of, within the Flemish and Dutch context, so the Dutch-speaking part of Europe, this is one kind of educational system. The postmaster is considered something after the masters, between a kind of legally framed as something that enhances critical thinking skills. So every discipline or every degree can have a postmaster, just to kind of clarify this. Whereas in the States, you would call this maybe a post-professional degree. So, back in the day when I was in school, you would have had students who were classmates of mine that would do they already had a kind of 5-year diploma degree, and then they would go and study. They would do a year program, and that would be a professional degree. So there are post-professional degree. So there are all these kind of misunderstandings, and I think this is something for us all within this kind of within this series, especially. I think it's important to, we try to equate things as being equal, but in fact, many things are apples and oranges in function of what we call architecture school, because I think that this also kind of goes within what are then the skill sets that we're building, what is the knowledge that we're contributing, what is the material that we're educating. So maybe this is something that we can get back to in a moment. But then let me answer now the question about the kind of public programming and its relationship to education. You know, one of the things in a big place like the Faculty of Architecture, there are, which at the moment has 4 departments that are very large. So there is a constant barrage of programming, unbelievable, things conflicting constantly. And so one of our ambitions since we arrived was to do a kind of 2-part public programming. So my idea had been that we would do the kind of typical Thursday, well, what we have on Thursday evenings, the typical sort of thinker, practitioner, designer lecture, you know, where it would be sort of unthemed and one presents the current work or, you know, current research topic, and then to do something, what we call the Berlage sessions with each semester is thematic, and that it basically, the topics bridge the history and theory and practice of architecture with contemporary questions and reality. And those series are thematic, as I said, thematic each semester, but they also bring together scholars, practitioners, established scholars, leading scholars, but also PhD researchers, you know, people who are just beginning their professional or academic life. So really to have a kind of balance and to have this kind of discourse. Also to,
and this year you had the competition, just to give an example to make that concrete. This year it was the competition, right, sort of series where, yeah, I think it was really interesting that it ranged from Tim Benton talking about his research to Kirsten Gears presenting a competition that he had.
Yeah, but I think this is, I mean, maybe how we got to this issue of building competitions was there had been some discussions with Berlage students and recent alum that there's the kind of mythology that the architectural competition is the way to begin a practice, to begin a career, to begin to experiment with a set of ideas. And the more we thought about this, it was, is this really the case in this day and age or not? So that's one thing. Also, that the building competition is always aligned to the winner and maybe not to, you know, the others involved, you know, in the process or all these things. So we really wanted to put those into question. But what was very interesting in this particular case was that it was very hard to find younger scholarship, for lack of a better term, related to this idea. So for example, well, we all know the famous story of Le Corbusier being kicked out of the Palace of Leagues, the Palace of the League of Nations competition. But then, you know, we know that, or maybe Léa-Catherine, and I don't know if our students know that, you know, this, so I thought that it was important to have that kind of knowledge because there's something like the Paris Opera House, all these things that are in the kind of still remain in the contemporary imagination, like the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, but which don't have a kind of grounding and which only go to a kind of, which only look at the winner, but to look at really what the processes were, the procedures, the juries, because to also, what we learned from Christopher Curtis Mead on the Paris Opera House competition is all the politics that still exists now existed then, basically, rivalries with housemen, that all these sorts of things. So maybe that the better project that could have won, did not win because, that would have ruined something in relation to housemen, for example. So anyways, I thought it was interesting to kind of break up that kind of the canon of what we consider architectural competitions, and then to relate that, and very important to relate that to more contemporary work and practices. So, it's these kinds of questions that public programming gives, and also in juxtaposition to, I think, other institutions where there's, in many schools of architecture where there is the star lecture series or the practitioner, where it's basically always the office or the personality that is au courant. So we really try to have a kind of balance to not have people that are only in the scene at the moment, that are only practicing, but to have, this kind of duality there to really open up the dialogue. And I think that is maybe one of our forms of institutional radicality. I mean, it's always really important to have 1 foot in the system, let's say, or in the circuit, and 2 feet out, or 1 foot out and a tail out, something like this. I really feel, because there has to be some kind of originality and a different kind of aspiration. And I believe strongly that, well, maybe I should say something about the size of the Berlage. I mean, there were, at the 30 years ago, the very beginning generations were very small, purposely small, and we made a radical decision. And this was something where I feel very supported by the TU Delft in this, and the faculty, and especially the dean, to kind of counter this balance, to maybe purposely reduce student numbers, to have a kind of to have a diversity and a kind of a diversity of personalities, of genders, of cultural backgrounds, to really contribute to a kind of dialogue in a unique way. Because as we can see everywhere, university programs, architecture programs especially, are in a moment of crisis, because what will happen when there are no international students anymore, right? Because that's sort of the thing that, well, to be blunt, that's the kind of cash cow in many universities. And I'm very proud, I must say, of the fact that this is not the case in our situation, that we, we want to be able to maintain what we do by having a kind of, let's say 12 to 15 students. That's really, that's the only way that we can do what we do. If we were to go to 30 students, which we were some years ago when we first arrived at UW, it's a whole different, it's a whole different animal, where you don't have a kind of interaction with students, and students, it's harder to interact. One of the things, maybe going back to the public program, that I think is so important, that our unique size allows our students to engage in not only one-on-one conversations, Q&As with lecturers, but also students are invited, we do a kind of rotation, are invited to join for dinner, to have a conversation, with the lecturers that we invite. And I think it's that, not only is it about educating, let's say, within the classroom itself, but there's also something about education at the dinner table, the kind of spontaneity that comes from, over a glass of sparkling water or wine, but that kind of other kind of intimacy that allows also students to feel comfortable and engaged. I mean, it's, I'm sure that we can all attest as educators that once you do this for a while, you can start to put students into certain types. You know, and it's always amazing. And this is to any students listening, it's always done without judgment, but it becomes clear, you know. And I think, you know, there are those that are always the go-getters and that are ambitious and initiators, self-initiators, and will go. But there are also really equally, you know, students who are shy, insecure, but shyness also doesn't mean insecure, but maybe more reserved, you know, that basically being able to engage in other ways, like around the dinner table, I think is something that's very important in order to kind of build up a kind of another kind of tool set besides that of drawing or model making or all those sort of conventional things that go with architectural education. I mean, I think this is something that we've had a lot of, well, there's been a lot of thinking behind this, and I don't really know how to make it contemporary, but it's something that's in my thinking is, especially in the Beaux-Arts education or in the more academy-based architecture education, you know, there were courses on etiquette, you know, in the 19th, early 20th century, up until the 50s in Belgium, I know for sure, where, you know, one of your required classes, which was what we were which we now maybe aligned more towards professional practice courses, was basically etiquette. You know, so if you were basically, you know, what do you do when you have your fish fork, but also how do you shake a hand? I think all these kinds of things, these forms of conventions and etiquette are things that still, you know, need to be engaged with. And maybe it's our international body of students that has also pushed that kind of thinking, you know, where there are different cultural conventions and one needs to be respectful to kind of maintain that.
Well, that's super interesting. And then maybe it's a good way also to move into the kind of more particular focus of this series of conversation, which is also what happens in an age of quarantine, and what happens to the Berlage in an age of quarantine. So this year the student went, so generation 30, the generation before finished in January, because there's always it's a 1.5 year program, right? So there's always
3 semesters and 1 semester overlaps.
Exactly. So the other ones went, and then generation 30 started the semester. I know because I met them like once in Delft, and then boom, the quarantine happened, and so the 13 of them had to go, you know, locked into their house, which is a very particular situation, I guess, because they come from all around the world also to be together, and then some of them, I think 2 or 3 went back to their you know, home country, but most of them stayed in the Netherlands, but in their house, and interacted virtually for the whole semester, sorry. But then what I wanted to say is that it also brought another color or something different to the public program, because last week was the sort of review, or as you say, it's not review, but it's mostly conversation, or let's say conversation week. So for 3 or 4 consecutive days, we had the 2 pro seminars and the studio and the thesis preparation. All the kind of conversation or presentation were done online, as with many institutions these days, and went also on YouTube and are available now for on the Berlage sort of YouTube channel or website. So I guess it helped you to experiment also with another form of intricacy between, you know, the public program and the educational part of the Berlage. So maybe you want to say something about how that worked or didn't work, or what was interesting about these experiments.
I mean, well, number one, I really just have to underscore that I think, Leah, we were very fortunate with a very collaborative and inspiring group of students that really used this moment to engage. So I sincerely mean that they had they had a lot of energy. They worked very hard, and it was also a kind of, let's say, a mentality, let's say, to be able to kind of survive this transition. I guess in many ways we were, we went into lockdown days after having arrived back from having done field work in Paris, and Tokyo. So this was an exceptional circumstance, but one thing that I think sort of, I don't want to say saved the semester, but it already put everything into our heads in a different way, was that the Friday before we went into lockdown, on Friday the 13th of all days, the students had a collective session, if I remember correctly, where they were talking about their kind of design research project, and that the next week would be a kind of review, and that they wanted to do a website. So this had been a kind of discussion. We didn't know at this point that we would go into lockdown, what exactly would happen. So this was a kind of serendipity. And I think then starting from that point, then the next kind of couple weeks progressed, and then they started to do this project global.nl website, which I have to say, then all of a sudden Cargo Collective puts it on its prize-winning page, so good for them. Newsletter, so do a little plug for that. But I think in that sense, we were very fortunate that there was already the kernels from the students themselves to be able to there was already a thinking to move to the kind of to the online, let's say, in terms of public dissemination. So also the importance to know to already, because we'd already been discussing things. Then, we essentially had to suspend our Thursday evening public programming because the, we just decided to do that, but then we decided to maintain what we call the Berlage sessions, this thematic. And we postponed things and rescheduled things. And I'm very grateful to also the kind of the lecturers that we invited, because they also had the kind of courage to kind of take on, most of them had not Zoomed before. So because many of them are pensioned, and it somehow kind of worked. And then from there, it went on, well, with your seminar, there was already the discussion to do visual essays, but then to put that onto an online platform, and then our final presentation week to really have a kind of what we would normally do within the halls of the Faculty of Architecture building, to then put that into the online world. And I think that was very good. I mean, it's interesting to have, I think we reached a broader public in that, on the one hand, I mean, one of the things, we're actually one of the first places that has been live. Now it's become all Quran to live stream or to put archive videos online. That was one of the first tasks that I did when I arrived in 2007. So it was already kind of happening, but we sort of more institutionalized that as an act. And so I think this is, I hear all the time, when people are working in AutoCAD, correcting red lines, that they're listening to lectures in the background, etc. So I hope that what we've started to do now is to transition into what are the possibilities of this kind of moment of quarantine for education, and not to see that as a negative. I mean, I think with our students, they had already had a lot of physical contact together. So they really had a kind of, with that first semester, a kind of collective bonding. I think we were all very, we had all spent about 2.5 weeks together in field work, and then lockdown sort of happened. So in that sense, we were maybe done with each other. Everybody needed their little bit of space in order to kind of a break from having been together for ages. But then, they, I think everybody, all of our tutors and teaching teams, yourself included, took it as a possibility and not as a kind of negative, even though we all complain I mean, I WhatsApped you on Saturday morning, you know, I was dead until about 11:30, you know, I felt like a truck ran over because the Zoom does require a level of intensity and things of this. But I still, but maybe, you know, maybe in this age of distraction and quarantine, this helps us to recalibrate a little bit and to have a kind of, to develop a longer attention span and things like this. I mean, I really want to see the Zoom or, you know, online remote education as a kind of, as a set of possibilities. I mean, yeah. I mean,
yeah, as you say, it was interesting for some funny coincidence of when it happened, and also as you say, in my seminar was about television, and we already had decided that this year the student would do a video essay, and they had to normally do an exhibition. Kind of part of their assignment was to curate an exhibition that would put these video to the public of the TU Delft, or the student that would pass by and stuff. But now we were able to transform that into a website, and the students were amazing in kind of designing and imagining this website, and then put all the videos. So now it's even more, as you say, it's even more public, and also because of the thematic, which was about television and how, you know, television is a window into the world and this relationship to screens. And so it also, you know, I think that the course took a little bit of a different color, but it was very easy to connect those thematics and those questions to things they were experiencing while the course was unfolding. So some of the video essay also combined this kind of history of television and domesticity with questions of you know, of things they were experiencing themselves. So I think it was a good way to, I mean, we have to find ways to turn it around in the end, but I think it was a quite positive outcome.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, but I think that's where a kind of thematic, like basically of the seminar, which explored, right, the spatial implications of television, or we could say, you know, video or things like this, is specific but broad enough to also be agile and change in relationship to a kind of given moment. I mean, going back to this issue of publicness and themes, I mean, I think it's, you know, we're sort of, yeah, maybe scares is not what I'm very cautious about personally is that in the, you know, come September and when we continue the academic year, everything is going to shift towards an immediate reaction to quarantine, COVID, other kind of topics that I don't know what then the real, let's say, and I'm very moralistic in saying this, what is the meaning of the work that we produce? I mean, you know, we have planned our public programming and themes for the next year already. And I thought very carefully, like, are we going to change this? No, because we can also, things are open and agile enough that the lecturers and students can react to that. And I think the seminar, that the outcome of your pro seminar really spoke to that, you know, by just making a few tweaks, you can be immediately reactive to a kind of contemporary moment. Because I think it will be really problematic that I guarantee you that what we're going to see is every architecture school is going to be talking about, you know, quarantine and the spatial implications of isolation and, you know, the psychoanalytic drama of all this. And where's the originality? Where's the real kind of discussion? It will then just be a kind of, let's say, it will be a loop. And so I hope that, you know, I guess the challenge for all of us would be to kind of, how do we deal with our reality, but then still deal within our own kind of thematic or safe interest.
Absolutely. And maybe, yeah, I already received some course syllabus for next year that are all about this. So it's already happening. But maybe we can go back a little bit to the history of the Berlage, because we only touched it briefly at the beginning. But one thing, and also while we're talking about kind of online education and globalization, so there's this also question even before the quarantine and C-19 and etc. of the globalization of education, right? And so we talked a little bit about that the other day, but how the Berlage is an institution that worked mostly with no fixed teaching staff and having like a few people, or now there's you as director of studies and a few people around, but most of the teaching staff are guest professor or guest tutor that are kind of reactive to the moment. And in the early days of the Berlage, it was based on the superstar of architecture that were teaching there. And you would come, for example, to study at the Berlage because they were, I don't know, Diller and Scofidio or Rem Koolhaas or etc. Now it's changing a little bit, because in an age of this kind of globetrotter tutor, where you go to an institute, I mean, these people teach in so many institutions that they're not so much attached to the institution anymore. So, you know, you have, I don't know, Kirsten Gears that teaches in Harvard, but also in Switzerland, and then also in somewhere else in a different school. So how this globalization of education is affecting the way the Berlage operates, which is a very particular institutional model, let's say, of yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe one of the things, I think one of the blessings of coming to the TU Delft was being able to kind of rethink that model a little bit, because it basically remained very stagnant for a long time, in a way similar to the AA now, I would say, which basically maintains on its legacy rather than projecting a new kind of vision forward. That's a little nasty to say, but I do sincerely believe that. In this case, I think what I realized from talk, I mean, for me, it's really important to talk to students. So I am always asking questions, advice, input from students, from our students, from recent alum, because I view this as a kind of ongoing, the Berlage is something, at least under my directorship or purview, will always be something that grows and that has its kind of, that evolves. And I think you can only get that from the input from the students, from applicants. I mean, we interview applicants to figure out what gravitates people. And I think more and more what became a kind of reality was that students don't, or at least the students we attract, do not have the desire to follow under a kind of personality. That there's really a set of issues that are very pertinent for them. Rather, it's dealing with the kind of local global conundrum, rather it's ecological and environmental issues, rather it's class and race divisions, etc. That this is the kind of reality. And so, you know, we always use the term that we are reality based, but that's not to go. It's not to go and you know, make clay bricks in Africa to make a hut. You know, that was one idea of something that was maybe more of a kind of reality educational, architectural education way of doing things, but reality based, because that's how you basically build, by taking the ingredients of the everyday of what is out there in the world. That's how I believe you can get students to think differently about the practice of architecture, establish their own agency, to not be cynical towards the profession, even though that may be the cases in many times for our students where they've been doing red line drawings or renderings and not engaged in, other real things. So in this sense, so the point being here about the kind of, I believe that this is what is the kind of, you have to know your demographic, who are the students that you are recruiting and what do you want? And also that's a position of an institution. I mean, I think it's very important to have senior people that define the culture of practice and discourse, but at the same time, there needs to be the kind of, a kind of complement to that. So a kind of pluralism, let's say, but not a pluralism where things cancel each other out, but they provide a kind of complementary and conflicting dialogues. I mean, we had a master class. We have master classes with masters, and we had a design master class in November with Hans Kohlhoff, and it was very enlightening for me because the kind of the way of working in model at 1 to 20 model, at 1 to 10 drawings through sketching and observation to establish a kind of establish a project was something very new was very new for our students. And, even some of them were getting irritated about how this was so old school, but at the end of the day, I do think that it's bringing in that kind of, that, let's say, what many of us would call conventional thinking or institutionalized thinking. I think I guarantee you that in a few years with some reflection, the students that were maybe more critical of that conventional way of working will have been opened up to something else. So I think there always needs to be that kind of balance. So, that I would ever think of Kohlhoff as being experimental. It really was in this sense, compared to other things.
And you have this, what is it, Tuesday coffee, or there's?
Oh yeah,
we have also an institution of this conversation.
We instituted this because, I'm the kind of person that is probably in the Berlage way too much, but that's my personality. I'm in it all the way. So when I'm into something, and so I think one of the things was, the kind of casual moments of meeting the students and passing through was sort of lost. So yeah, we try to set up something like the Berlage coffee break, where every Tuesday, we can just bullshit about making coffee, making cinnamon rolls. I don't know, at some point I even thought we should have the Berlage brunch challenge. You send off a recipe for some kind of pancake, and then we see who can come out with it, but I do think it's this level of, we're very privileged in the sense that we're a small group, so we can do that, but it is, I think, very important to cultivate and stimulate a culture of dialogue. And going back to, we have, we're like a little mini UN. Our students are from, I think we have 13 students now, and I guess from 10 different countries, something like this. I may be off by one, but, how do you get people to negotiate to, everybody's coming from a different kind of background, a different way that they empower themselves culturally, methodologically, so we, let's say globalization has allowed everything to kind of have a kind of flatness, which doesn't necessarily exist. So how do you, so you need these kinds of moments like the coffee break to also to stimulate them, and to basically find ways to negotiate and have diplomacy and things like this, because we do not have, yes, there are agile frameworks that come down like this, but there are also things that come up like this. And so we meet in the middle. So, in that sense, the Berlage's education is something, within the kind of mechanics of a university system now, you need to have your learning outcomes and your syllabus, and how do you assess what you grade, and how do you do that, and all this kind of thing. But you can do that, and that's and I can deal with, and maybe even there's a part of my brain that loves doing that kind of stuff, but it's also that stuff can kind of be put aside, because you can still stimulate and develop a curriculum which comes from the students' own set of interests, and their own, what they're wrestling with in their own head. So going back to this semester and the seminar,
But
able to negotiate.
yeah, that's quite strong, I think, from what I experienced, those 2 semester, it's quite strong also in the way they work with their output. And we didn't touch, but that was one of my questions, the thesis project, which is what they do in the last sort of 8 months of the program, where I think what is really interesting is this kind of constant negotiation between the group and the personal interests. So in the thesis project, you always choose a site, which is different every year. So last year they were working on Gibraltar, and this year they're working on Norway. And there's always I only saw the result of the Gibraltar, where I was quite impressed by the exhibition. So they did, in times of physical contact, they did a physical exhibition that was a very strong collaborative work, both in terms of the content, but also of the sort of curating and display strategies. And then each of them go on and develop an individual component. And it's also true in the pro seminar, where you feel that there is really the group, and that they work together and have a very tight relationship, at least by the second semester where I come in. But they also always then develop something that really comes from their personal interest. And it's like, I think you can see also because I now saw the presentation from my seminar, but also from the other pro seminar by Rainer de Graaf, and you can feel the kind of connection between the work they do in one seminar and in the other, in the sense that they have a line, most of them have like a line of inquiry they are interested in, and I guess they carry this through the program more or less. And so I think this, I don't know if you have something to comment on that, but this kind of how they learn both in the program.
I don't know how it really happens, but I guess maybe the focus is on this. And I don't mean this in any cynical way whatsoever, but what is the point of doing a postmaster or post-professional degree? Unless you are there to basically find out what you are interested in and what you want, because there's no professionalization to that. So there's no, and if they really wanted to only build buildings, they would be doing that, So there is a kind of intellectual desire to figure out what they're about and gain more knowledge. So in that sense, I think that kind of that line is there. I think that it's also a kind of per student, but I think it's also, what I always say is, at this point, they are who they are, and they have their own sets of interests. And if they just remain confident about what those sets of interests are, it's then easy to shift from, a project in Tokyo to a pro seminar, to one pro seminar, to another pro seminar, to thesis work, and to develop a body of work, and then based on, one's own interest. And I think we have one student who, at the beginning of the year, we always ask, what do you want to make in a year's time? What would you like to make? Or what would you like to do? And one student, said, learn to sew. So now, they take it as a joke, but I'm expecting, that she's going to sew some drawings and some clothes, and that she's going to transpose an interest to learn how to sew and to cut patterns and to convert that into some kind of architectural project. Because I believe that there's the possibility within that, but it's also creating a culture within which a student believes that there is the possibility to take an interest like sewing and transpose it into something spatial and architectural. I think at the end of the day, what is the point of doing this work is to get students to have clear positions for themselves. I mean, we're in a kind of world, a crazy ass world, where there are too many positions, too much keeping up with the Joneses, too much, do I do this kind of project because other people are doing this kind of project? I've been seeing a lot online that all sorts of schools are now doing islands as kind of topics. And then it's like, then all of a sudden, one thing enters the public imagination or the cultural imagination, and then it all becomes it becomes a thing. So I think it's really important to get students to, to realign what is to realign themselves. I think the US, one other thing about the thesis, I mean, how we basically develop the thesis work is we call it a kind of collective project. And then individual contributions. So, there was a moment in not so long ago in our history, our recent pre-TU Delft history, where basically kind of final projects were basically really taught were taught by, let's say, masters. And then it was basically having students basically being almost forced to produce things as though they were members of an office, in function of a kind of collective. And one of the things that I was very adamant about was to reintroduce this kind of thesis where there was individual development, an individual positioning, but still maintain an idea of collectivity, so that each generation of students, each thesis core has to also develop its own value system or its own terms of engagement or parameters within which they want to work. And it is not by any means an easy task to do this. So, we do not give a brief. What we give is a site. We give maybe some kind of keyword or something to spur a discussion, but then it is really the students that are then meant to kind of structure a kind of the theme, make a particularity, and then and structure their way of working collectively, which is also not always very easy, but it's always, in terms of what is one's interests, skill sets, where do they want to develop, and then how you plug in that individual contribution to that collective project. I mean, this is a terrible analogy, but it's like the collective project is essentially like the final image of a puzzle, right? That's what you want to get to. And then there are all these 13, we have a cohort right now of 13 students where each individual puzzle piece has to come together, and sometimes maybe a piece of that puzzle will be broken or it will be jammed in. But I think this is the only way to get students to basically develop develop a position and develop an understanding. I mean, now one of our most fundamental things this semester, going back to architectural education in the age of quarantine, is normally we would have done field work to our thesis site this year, which is Norway. Well, that couldn't happen. So, we also had to be reactive and to develop a set of assignments, which we have called remote site documentation, and which the students will still continue to develop, or they're still continuing to develop that work now, is how then can you engage, how can you do field work or site documentation without being able to go there. I mean, there are many examples. I mean, Le Corbusier famously never went to see his most wonderful house. He never went to the site of his most wonderful house in La Plata, So there was a moment where people did not travel to the sites of their projects, but they found other ways to do documentation. And I think that we have become so used to in the last 20 years that we need to travel, that we need to go and experience things in order to take action. And this has really put me into question is, do we need to, do we? Yes, of course, there's the part of me that says yes, but then I also wonder, well, maybe not either, you know, or what are the other tools? You know, can you have other forms of engagement? Going back to this idea of remote site documentation, you know, not only looking through satellite imagery or things like this, but it's also an opportunity where we're asking our students, and nobody I think took up the offer yet, but, you know, can you basically outsource some work? You know, there are all these kinds of other kinds of platforms where, you know, can you say, okay, you know, we have one student who obsessively, you know, chronicles photographs in, with a seriality. And so, you know, can you already ask somebody to go and take 100 photographs you know, at this particular ratio, at this eye height, you know, so there are other forms of engagement that which fieldwork gives you that maybe doing this remotely can also have the, can also be just as engaged and maybe even expand the idea of collaboration. And
exactly, other forms of, I was thinking
yes.
other forms of collaboration,
Yeah.
because they could, for example, enter, I don't know, in dialogue with maybe not architects because they're probably too busy, but maybe students that are, you know, their peers in Oslo
And
or in Bergen.
exactly.
And
No,
yeah.
but we had this idea too that, you know, could you already establish, this was one idea that maybe I will bring it back in, but could you establish a kind of protocol for site documentation related to one's own individual contribution, and then find a partner, you know, in another university or in an architecture office, and then to kind of give kind of input. So I think in this sense, there are all sorts of possibilities. So I mean, I very much hope that that, you know, that travel will continue again and that we'll be able to do field work and all these things. But I do not think that it is the end all be all to forming relationships and learning about a site and a context, you know. And I think we all need to be, you know, we all need to also be open to that idea. I mean, there used to be a moment where, I don't know, you know, as somebody now traveling all the time, you know, I used to, sometimes I don't even read about where I'm going or where the hotel is that I'm being booked or something like this. You just go. And, you know, there was a moment, you know, where, you know, one would buy the travel guide and you would anticipate and you would be looking forward to something. And we had a kind of, there was a kind of pause to that. But now, you know, a kind of compression. And now we're so kind of expansive that there's no space anymore for that kind of excitement. So I do hope that this moment kind of recalibrates, how we operate in that, you know. And I mean, again, I know we need to end, but maybe to finish with this, you know, going back to this thing, you know, architecture schools used to do, and I sound like an old fart, I know, but projects and things within the sites within which they operate. So, you know, in Delft had a huge legacy here. We're doing work in the Netherlands. Well, then with this kind of global vision of an education, things spread out. And I wonder anymore, you know, what happens if we retreat back? I mean, when I was in graduate school at Columbia, we had 9 semesters of studio. It was only the last semester where you left the confines of New York City. So the work, you know, the education was there on the ground. And I think that the last few years has basically expanded something. And now maybe this is the moment for schools to also think about their own agenda setting in place of their specific context and then their local culture of knowledge and what it can provide. So
yeah, that's really interesting because it's the yeah, now it's like in some architecture school you would go and you would have studios absolutely everywhere. It's like no one does studio in local context. So I guess it's the same as we'll have to do local tourism and we'll have to do local studio education, right?
Yeah, or to be proud of what our local context is. And what is there. You know, it's shameful that I've lived in the Netherlands 13 and a half years that I don't speak Dutch, that I don't know enough about the kind of brick construction the brick patterns, how each city has a different color brick and pattern because of its geographic location. I mean, that for me, it's shameful if I have to be honest, you know, because that's what makes it rich to have that understanding. And how can I ever transpose that to a group of students if I don't know that myself? You know?
There you go, thesis project next year in the Netherlands.
You know,
hate to interfere with your
no,
university.
please.
Yeah, we just have like 15 minutes left, and we have some questions. Since we just discussed some of the new possibilities of education, I'd like to ask a question from one of our listeners, viewers. What do you think of using computer games, video games, in classes? Maybe especially after having a pro seminar on television and architecture, maybe some new media could be also rediscovered. What do you think about that? And maybe other ways that you could imagine or you are interested in?
Well, one of the things with Leah is, so a kind of former student and friend had come when we had to shift things online, saw some advice, and he had suggested basically, what is it, Twitch TV, right? The kind of gaming platform. And then with Leah, you know, we kind of talked about that. And would that be the kind of medium to do the space television, space architecture, space television architecture presentation? I think I think having then spent some hours in my constant insomnia, I personally could imagine doing that. But what happens at some point is, what then is, it becomes, how does one learn the technique to engage the medium? So this is maybe the architect in me, which I strongly believe, or the designer in me, that I personally need to know the techniques of the medium or the format in order to basically be creative and think about how it could be worked in a kind of didactic and pedagogical way. So, you know, maybe this will be a summer hobby when I shut down from manuscript writing, which should really be the priority, as it is every summer for the last 3 years, but never is. No, but I mean, Leah, how do you, in reflection of the kind of great, you know, so the visual essays were great. I think I like the website and the kind of, you know, the kind of retro hipster TV guide. But then, I mean, I think the thing about these gaming platforms is that's 21st century. You know, this now. Yeah. I fall into the trap of the mannerist aesthetic, you know, the hipster. Yeah. So how do we basically create something that is projected to 2020, 2025, you know, or anticipates this?
No, I think it's interesting, of course, and there's a lot to say about, you know, video games and architecture. A bit like Salomon, it's not something I'm particularly knowledgeable about, so I would have difficulty teaching it. But I had some students also in the past, also in other contexts, in studio, or that wanted to. So one of my students once did a project about these, and I learned a lot because I didn't know anything about that, about these big events in Asia where people go into like stadium to, I don't know, there's probably a name for that, where they go to watch other people play video game. Now this happens also more online, but used to be. And so he wanted to design one of those, you know, venue for this. But as Salomon said, what was interesting with the television is that obviously for the generation of students that are now, I mean, I don't know exactly how old they are, but you can imagine for them, television as a media that was kind of made popular in the post-war period, or at least this format of television doesn't exist anymore, and they never really, this kind of broadcasting television, they never really experienced it. They only kind of experienced narrowcasting, which is still television, but it's a completely different relationship to the media. So I think it was interesting in that retroactive or historical rather than projective, because they could also make the link, and because of COVID and the situation, as we mentioned before, they were really able to make the link between this thing that is almost like an archaeology for them, that is something completely from the past. And of course there's this whole retro nostalgia aesthetic that is also sort of cool, but they probably never had to look at a TV guide, I mean, as kids, or most of them. And then so to have this kind of oscillation between the historical and the projective is quite interesting. So maybe that's why using a media like television as opposed to like video games.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, well, before I have too much anecdotitis, but when the TV guy would arrive by post, that was always such a big deal. And my God, I'm not that old, that it was like, oh, wow, what's going to happen for the week? What are the articles in there? It was like, that was the moment on Monday, that was like exciting. But now I just think, but I mean, maybe though the kind of the format, I mean, we should answer another question, but maybe next year in terms of the seminar, you could use the gaming format is basically in an immersive environment. So maybe looking at the kind of spatial implications of television that could be, if we do another iteration of that particular topic, it could be a platform, literally and figuratively, within which to submerge oneself into the space of the television. I mean, in that sense, so it does. So let's say using the kind of gaming format to answer a set of spatial questions or something like this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For the final, I will have one more question. Just let me read it. Do you think, regarding among others, one of the last Birlage themes necessarily Eurometropolitan, do you think that this local approach could or might be representative for the European, not necessarily only Dutch approach? So how do you, basically, as I understand this, how do you define locality? If you're saying that not speaking Dutch, for example, but you're not saying that, well, I don't know how many languages do you speak, but how many languages do you have to speak to consider yourself local?
Yeah, I mean,
is it just one or more than one?
I think, well, maybe on this, one of the great things about having an international collective is that many of our students speak multiple languages. So basically, in essence, this idea, sources and resources can come from all different kinds of contexts, which, for example, you would never get in a kind of American university where, you hope that somebody has Spanish and French, but not necessarily Russian, for example. But maybe this, I think maybe part of this question, if I see it correctly in the chat, is also maybe European versus Dutch, but maybe I would take it like this. There's a kind of culture within the Netherlands of basically a problem solving culture, and that's not only in the Netherlands, but that's within architectural education as a whole, that you are given a problem and then you are asked to solve it. So I think that kind of education is valid in more formative moments, in a kind of bachelor or master education. That's not something that we really aspire to in our postmaster education, because the people should be, we want our students to be problematizing sets of conditions. So basically establishing their own hypothesis and then testing that out within whatever their project is, even if it's not only in design, but also in something that's more theoretical or research like Leah's seminar, to put forward a position, a hypothesis, test that. And like any experiment, it will either be a success or a failure. And so I think going about developing a kind of position or a consciousness is about learning, is about helping students to learn how to problematize very complex situations. So, and I mean, maybe one of these things, I don't use the word experiment now, but I purposely try to keep all those words, which I think are so 1990s, experimentation, laboratory, radicality, all these things to the kind of edge of the discussion, because I think that they have been eviscerated of all kind of meaning. So in that sense, I hope that what we do, or what we've tried to do here in this discussion, is show that maybe, let's say, experimentation can exist in other forms without having to basically brand itself as being unique, or, radical, for lack of another bad,
overloaded.
Overused, because everybody believes that, the moment that you have to basically claim, I believe, that you are doing something experimental or radical, that's the moment when I don't believe that you actually are. But that, again, is my own moralism.
I'd like to ask just one question from myself, and unfortunately, we'll have to finish after that, after your answer. But that's the question for both of you. When you were discussing the problem of globe-trottering masters, I was very intrigued by what Salomon was saying about issue-driven education, not personality or program-driven, issue-driven education. But speaking about reality, would it be also fair to say that issues are not purely architectural one, or when they are architectural, they're mostly based on retrospective and historical ways of teaching, learning from different architectural history. So the question which I started thinking of is, what is the virtue? I think we kind of feel that it's needed, but what do you think? What is the virtue of keeping allegiance with architectural discipline when we're interested in issues?
Yeah, maybe this is one example that I strongly believe that any economic, social, political issue has its spatial implication, but it is the lens within which how you calibrate that. So, and that it poses a design possibility or a design critique, or that all these issues are embedded in the design object. So, for example, I gave this example. We had our kind of first thesis work in progress conversation last week, and I gave this example that, a lot of times what we do is we ask students, or we've been experimenting with this, to kind of start with a building type, and then to ask a set of questions through that building type. Okay, and I gave you a kind of concrete example. So if somebody comes to me and says they're interested in gender issues, so that's great. Okay, so then I give the example of the U.S. Capitol building, which basically, if you look at where the washrooms are, the women's washrooms are at the complete opposite end of the building, because women were only elected into Congress. Well, let's say in the post-war period, I forget the exact year, I should probably know that. And so what happens then is when there's the kind of filibuster, or the kind of moment of speaking, basically, the men's washrooms are just 1 minute away, 10 footsteps away. So for me, that would be a way to talk about, let's say, gender disparity, in an architectural sense. And, I'm very conscious about using that as using that example as a male, but for me, this is, one of the first things, if somebody, I would, if somebody wanted to talk about, gay issues or LGBTQAI, whatever all this, it would maybe be I would say go to the cliche of the gym and the locker room, and what is then, how do you then pose a kind of set of questions of what it means to be in that kind of collective space. So that's where that would be my position on this. I don't know where Leah's is. I mean, I'm curious to hear.
Well,
because then it becomes design questions it transposes,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Also, if we take, for example, the 2 pro seminars that you decided to put on the program for this last semester, they take also the reverse, which is to start from either media, social aspect in the case of my seminar, space, television, and architecture, and then the other seminar was the asset class. So it was really starting from a sort of economic question and then looking at spatial implication. But rather than, I think it works really well the 2 ways around. So as you say, to start from a question and then move to the building, or start from a more general sort of societal aspect, and then look what are the spatial and architectural implication, rather than going into a history of architecture or theory of architecture per se. So it's also a way to approach. I mean, in my seminar, for example, and it was really, I think, evident from the video essay that the student did, but there was a set of thematic, from power and control to domesticity to I don't remember, but questions of inside, outside, etc. So all these questions were kind of addressed through television and its spatial implication, but of course are questions that are extremely important for architects or for designers. So I think that's also the way that this program is working.
I mean, maybe one way I know you probably want to go, but I think this, for me, the last 25 to 30 years has seen the removal of the architectural object as the kind of point of discussion. And I purposely do not use building, but we could use building. I say architectural object, and I do believe that I believe in design. I believe in buildings. I believe in architecture with a lowercase a as an abstraction, as a kind of analogy to other things. I also believe in architecture with a capital A as buildings, as something that is tectonic, that is material. I believe it as something that is as a representation that is that can be done through paper, imagery, models for virtual reality. So I believe in definitely in an expansive definition of architecture, but I really do believe that the irony in this is that we're in a kind of moment that's very object-oriented. If we look at Instagram, if we look at Pinterest, if we look at references, and not within just architecture, but everywhere. And then the irony is that I do not believe that architecture always comes late to the game. That's always been for centuries, right? So, it's going back into this, whatever this object is, the architectural object, because I believe in design. And I believe that, we have a kind of, we have a polluted built environment that could be made so much richer if we talked about design. And we don't necessarily need to go back to the golden section. We don't need to go back to classical orders, but there is a kind of, there is something, there are still validities and composition, proportion, making beautiful things. And more than anything, if everybody is now baking peanut bread and baking bread and cookies and all sorts of things in their quarantine, I wonder, maybe it would be nice if people were also looking at, the design of objects and the quality of how you make something.
Okay.
It's a good word of to finish on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Salomon and Léa-Catherine, for joining us for this discussion and for bringing the history and the everyday and the spirit, I would say, of the Berlage to our program. It's a really important contribution to have different approaches. And of course, I thank all the participants, attendees, viewers, listeners today, and they will be watching us in future on YouTube for your attention. And our interpreter, Lia Bralize, for her contribution to this conversation. Our next meeting will be held very soon, actually, on Saturday, and featuring Professor Troy Sham from the Rice School of Architecture, another institution, another view. Rice School is in the United States. And architects Derek Duane and Daniel Roche will be also interviewing him. Follow the announcements in our social networks and on the program website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll
Alexander.
be following your work and hopefully meet again.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, thank you. And thank you, Léa, for being, for your collegiality and friendship in this. So, in being a good sparring partner. And also, I should say thank you to our alumna, Anastasia, for prompting.
Absolutely.
Yes. So, thank you. All right. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Good evening.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.